Hello Econ 151 students. I wanted to follow up the previous Lesson 2 video with something that specifically relates to the Chapter 3 in our text materials. So in the previous video, I discussed the basic concepts of comparative advantage and the gains from trade. In this chapter, we're asked to put that into practice in a little more specific way. So in Chapter 3 in our text, we're asked to understand why nations might be economically interdependent, why it is that trade makes everyone better off, to go back over those concepts of absolute and comparative advantage, and then to see how they are the same and different. So it starts with the definition or understanding of the term interdependent. And you can see in the photograph here that there are lots of good examples of how we might be interdependent using goods from other nations, things like that. From Chapter 1, which was not assigned in this course, but is something you may have glanced at in the text, we know that trade is a principle that can make everyone better off. And we're told that, and we are going to demonstrate that in this chapter. We're going to see the actual gains from trade. And so now we're going to learn about why this is that trade makes everyone better off. So we start with the example of the U.S. and Japan, and we use that production possibilities simplifying assumption that we have two goods, computers and wheat, and we're going to look at one resource, which is labor, and that's the input that goes into producing these goods, measured in hours. And we're going to see, using that one input of labor, how much of both goods each country can produce and consume. So if the country chooses to be self-sufficient, we can measure it. If they choose to trade with another country, we're going to take a look. So we can see that we have some information here about what the U.S. can produce. They have 50,000 hours of labor available for production each month, and we know that to produce one computer takes 100 hours of labor, and to produce 1 ton of wheat takes 10 hours of labor. If we calculate that, we can see that the U.S. has enough labor to produce 500 computers or 5,000 tons of wheat. And because we're going to simplify this model, we have a straight line production possibilities frontier. We can see that they could produce, if they use all of their resources, their labor resources, the U.S. could produce 5,000 tons of wheat and 0 computers, or they could produce 500 computers and 0 units of wheat, or some combination along this production possibilities frontier. So that's what we know right now. Without trade, this is what the U.S. can produce and consume, anything along this curve. And so let's suppose, for example, that the U.S. uses half of its labor to produce each of the two goods. That means that they're going to produce 250 computers and 2,500 tons of wheat. So we're going to have this point right here on the curve, and this is a combination that they can produce given their resources. So this is an opportunity here for you to practice that same thing using the information for Japan. You're told that Japan has 30,000 hours of labor for production each month, that to produce one computer costs 125 hours of labor, and to produce 1 ton of wheat requires 25 hours of labor. So following the example for the U.S., I want you to take a moment, pause the video, and calculate how much of each good that Japan can produce, and put that into a graphical format, into a production possibilities frontier, just to make sure that you're comfortable with representing this information graphically. And be sure that you put the computers on the horizontal axis, and then your wheat will be on the vertical axis, like you saw before with the U.S. model. So take a moment, pause this, and then we'll go through the answer. So Japan's PPF, once we do all that, we know that we do a little division, and Japan has enough labor to produce 240 computers, or they could produce 1,200 tons of wheat. So we put those 2 points on the PPF, we can connect them with the straight line, and we understand that any combination along the PPF can be produced by Japan. Without trade, let's imagine that Japan, like the U.S., uses half of its labor to produce each good. So we can find that point that's going to be 100 computers and 600 tons of wheat. And if we put that into the graph, we can see that that point is right here, and of course it falls along that production possibilities frontier. So without trade, we understand that U.S. consumers are going to get those 250 computers and 2,500 tons of wheat that we saw before, and this was that assumption that we're using half of the labor hours for each of the two goods. And Japan will get the 120 computers and 600 tons of wheat. And the assumption here is that the consumers within those nations will have those things to consume, because we're not trading, we're not going back and forth between the two nations, so what is produced domestically is going to be consumed domestically. So we're going to compare consumption in that frame with trade, and so we can see how that's going to be different for the two nations. So right now we're assuming there's no trade and that half of the labor hours are devoted to production of each of the two goods. So first we need to see how much of each good is produced and traded by the two countries. So here we go. This is another opportunity to practice, and this is looking at the production of those two countries. So now we're going to make a new assumption. Suppose that the U.S. produces 3,400 tons of wheat, and the question is, how many computers would the U.S. be able to produce with its remaining labor? And I want you to see this graphically and put this on the U.S. PPF. So if we produce 3,400 tons of wheat, how many computers are they going to be able to produce? And then the other part of this problem is going to be, suppose that Japan produces 240 computers, how many tons of wheat would Japan be able to produce with its remaining labor? So draw this point on Japan's PPF. Now remember, you've been told how many hours of labor it takes to produce each of these goods. So you're going to want to go back to that information, do a quick little division, and you should be able to find how many labor hours are left over and what that means in terms of production for each country. Go ahead and pause this, and then when you're ready, come back to it and we'll go through it. So here we are with the U.S. production. We're told that they produced 3,400 tons of wheat. We know that each ton of wheat required 10 labor hours. So of their 50,000 labor hours, they used 34,000 to produce wheat. That means that the remaining 16,000 hours were used to produce 160 computers, since we were told that each computer required 100 hours of labor to complete. So we have our production, and we can see what the combination was. And that was a little bit of a process of working backwards through it. Here for Japan's production, we were told that they produced 240 computers, and since we know that each computer required 125 hours to produce, that consumed all of Japan's 30,000 labor hours. So what they're able to produce was 240 computers and 0 tons of wheat, because they are at this point on the production possibilities frontier. Now we're going to move forward and look at exports and imports. The definitions are here, and I think they're pretty straightforward. A little chance to practice understanding exports and imports here. Suppose that the U.S. exports 700 tons of wheat to Japan and imports 110 computers from Japan. So just so we're clear on this, Japan is on the other side of that, and they're importing those 700 tons of wheat, and they're exporting the 110 computers. So how much of each good is consumed in the U.S.? And using, again, the same information we've been looking at, put this combination on the U.S. PPF, and how much of each good is consumed in Japan. And you can put this on Japan's PPF as well. Go ahead and pause this, work through it, and then you can compare your answer to see how you did. So here's the information that we've been working with, and this, of course, is the production information from the last exercise. And so here we go. We've got, in the U.S., they produced 160 computers. That's from the information we had before. And they produced 3,400 tons of wheat. So that's how much they made. If they imported 110 computers, but no wheat, they didn't import any wheat, and they exported 700 units of wheat or tons of wheat, then their consumption is going to be what's left over. So the total consumption of computers is going to be 270 million, I assume, and the consumption of wheat will be 2,700 tons of wheat. So they're able to consume what's left from their production and what they import. Right? So in this case, it's what they produced plus what they imported. Here it's what they produced minus the amount that they sold to another country. So their consumption is this combination. Now here's what's interesting about that. Notice that the combination, if we plot that graphically, it falls outside the production possibilities frontier. And this is an important thing to understand. This is what we're talking about with the gains from trade. You can see them graphically, and you can understand that they weren't able to produce either of those combinations. If they tried to produce those, that was not something they could do along this line. That fell outside of their production possibilities frontier, which we would have called impossible or unattainable. And yet, one of the really great benefits of trade is that they can consume beyond their production possibilities frontier. We look at Japan's consumption, they're going to have a similar scenario. Given that information from before, they were producing 240 computers, but no wheat. So they're going to import those 700 tons of wheat from the U.S., and they're going to export 110 of their computers, and the net is what they keep. So of computers, they're going to be able to consume 130 computers, and because they imported the wheat, they're going to be able to consume 700 tons of wheat. If you look down here in the production possibilities frontier again, Japan's consumption falls outside their production possibilities frontier. So when we say that trade actually allows nations to consume more than they produce, this is one of the major benefits of trade, that it allows both nations to be better off. And so here's the basic rule. Trade makes both countries better off. We just saw a good example of that. And we can see the gains of trade. In the U.S., they gained the consumption of 20 computers and the consumption of 200 units of wheat. Japan, through the same transactions, even though Japan had far less ability to produce, in terms of absolute advantage, that Japan didn't have an absolute advantage in either of those two goods. However, with trade, we look at comparative advantage. And because Japan was able to produce computers at a lower opportunity cost than the U.S., they were able to gain and benefit from trade as well. So when Japan made those trades, they gained 10 computers and they gained 100 units of wheat. So where do the gains come from? Well, we go back to a few definitions here. Absolute advantage, which is that ability to produce a good using fewer inputs, and so, or using the same inputs and being able to produce more. It's the same idea. And that would be absolute advantage. Well, it's an interesting concept, but it's not very useful in terms of understanding trade, because in the example we just looked at, the U.S. has a pretty significant absolute advantage in wheat production, and they can do it much, much cheaper, to use the term, than the Japan. It costs them 10 labor hours in the U.S. to produce wheat and 25 to produce in Japan. So the U.S. has an absolute advantage there. Now, if each country has an absolute advantage in one good and specializes in that good, then both countries can gain from trade. So absolute advantage is the ability to produce it at a lower cost. But really, the gains in trade come from comparative advantage, which is the ability to produce one at a lower per unit opportunity cost. And that was what I addressed in the previous video, showing you how we measure the opportunity cost of one good in terms of what was given up in production of the other good. So in this case, we saw that the U.S. had an absolute advantage in both goods. So you might be saying, wait a minute, absolute, comparative, what is all this? Absolute advantage simply means that using the same resources you can produce more, or you can produce the same amount using less resources. So in this case, we could see that the U.S. has an absolute advantage in both computers and wheat production. So this brings up the question of why is it that Japan is specializing in computers? Because they don't have an absolute advantage in those. And this is why I said absolute advantage is an interesting concept, but not a very useful one in understanding trade. So now we're going to look at the idea of comparative advantage. And so there are two measures of the cost of a good. Two countries can gain from trade when each produces what they can do at the lowest cost. And by lowest cost, we mean lowest opportunity cost. And the opportunity cost we're talking about is what you give up in production of the other good. This is why we use the two good model for production possibilities, because we're measuring the cost of one good in terms of what you give up of the other good. So there are two measures of cost then. There's comparative advantage, which is what you can produce at the lowest cost, and there's absolute advantage, which measures the cost of the good in terms of the inputs. In the example we've been looking at, the opportunity cost of a computer is how much wheat could have been produced using that input of labor. So understanding opportunity and cost and comparative advantage is going to be the key here. Comparative advantage is the ability to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another producer. And by opportunity cost, again, we mean what you give up of the other good. So we can look at this previous example and say, which country has a comparative advantage in computers? And so we can look at the opportunity cost of a computer in each country. And I showed this to you in the previous video, and it's worth going over again, but this is that concept of comparative advantage. We simply measure and compare the opportunity cost. So here's what we know that to produce one computer in the U.S. costs the production of 10 tons of wheat, because we know that it requires 100 labor hours to produce a computer and 10 labor hours to produce a ton of wheat. So for each one computer that's produced, 10 tons of wheat could have been produced. We know that in Japan, the opportunity cost of producing one computer is 5 tons of wheat. Again, because we know that it costs 125 labor hours to produce a computer, and that same 125 hours could be used to produce 5 tons of wheat. So what they give up when they make these production decisions is what is measured here. So what you can see from this is that to produce a computer costs less for Japan. They only give up 5 tons of wheat, whereas the U.S. gives up 10 tons of wheat. So Japan has a comparative advantage in computer production. They can do it at a lower per unit opportunity cost. And the lesson here is that absolute advantage really is not the basis for understanding trade and the gains from trade. It's really based on opportunity cost and comparative advantage. The gains from trade then arise from this comparative advantage. And when each country specializes in the good that they can produce at the lowest opportunity cost, then both nations can benefit from trade. And this would apply to individual producers as well, who benefit from specializing in what they can do at the lowest opportunity cost and trading with each other. Here's another opportunity to practice. And I encourage you to always try these active learning exercises. Try them and then test yourself, see how you do with it. So here we have two countries, Argentina and Brazil. Each have 10,000 hours of labor per month, and that's their input. And in Argentina, they can produce 1 pound of coffee with 2 hours of labor. They can produce 1 bottle of wine with 4 hours of labor. In Brazil, a pound of coffee requires 1 hour of labor, and a bottle of wine requires 5 hours of labor. So if we know that they both have the same 10,000 hours of labor, what I want you to try to solve here is which country has an absolute advantage in the production of coffee, which country has a comparative advantage in the production of wine. So pause the video, give it a try, see if you can work out those numbers, and I would even encourage you to put it into a production possibilities frontier model so that you can see it graphically. So what we know is that Brazil has an absolute advantage in coffee because they can do it with less resources, right? They only use 1 labor hour in Brazil, but it takes 2 hours in Argentina. Argentina has the comparative advantage in wine because the opportunity cost of producing wine for Argentina is 2 pounds of coffee, because the 4 labor hours required to produce a bottle of wine could instead produce 2 pounds of coffee. So that's the explanation. Their opportunity cost of producing wine is 2 pounds of coffee. They give up 2 pounds. whereas Brazil's opportunity cost of producing 1 unit of wine is 5 pounds of coffee. So Argentina can do it at the lower per unit opportunity cost, and they have the comparative advantage in producing that. Some unanswered questions in this chapter. We make a lot of assumptions about the quantities of each good that the country produces, trades, and consumes. And you notice that in our examples. And we also make some assumptions about the prices of trade. In the real world, these quantities and prices are going to be determined by what consumers want, by technology and resources are available. And we will address that in the next chapter. To summarize this chapter, we know that interdependence and trade allow everyone to enjoy a greater quantity and variety of goods and services. We know that comparative advantage means being able to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost. We know that absolute advantage means that you can produce at a good with fewer inputs. And we know that when people or countries specialize in the goods in which they can produce at a lower opportunity cost, that everybody is better off. So this is chapter 3. I hope you will spend some time with this video, with the previous video that kind of does another version of explaining the concept of comparative advantage and trade. And we will continue this as we go forward in macroeconomics. Best of luck.